All right, so how are you guys?
Doing well, Igor. Thanks for having us.
Sure. Okay, so I think that first of all, despite the fact that I don't think that you guys need an introduction, I think I'd still love one, especially Mike, who's here a second time. I'm guessing that we could make it a bit shorter, but go right ahead. I'd love to know your background in fitness and everything that you've done so far.
Everything.
So I was born in Children's Hospital in Oakland in 1983 on the border of Berkeley.
What kind of day was it outside there?
I wasn't really forming permanent memories yet, but I remember crying, getting slapped in the butt. Okay. In all seriousness, no, honor to be here. I am Eric, and I am basically just someone who got way too obsessed with lifting weights and looked up one day, and it had provided him a career, a focus, and an outlet for creativity and all that fun stuff. I started as a personal trainer back in 2005. I was lifting a year and a half before that. So yes, like everyone else, I started training people too early in my own lifting career. But I quickly learned how terrible I was and started to upskill intellectually. And fast forward to 2017, I completed my PhD here at the Auckland University of Technology in New Zealand, with an emphasis on strength conditioning. My second master's was on a sports nutrition topic within the broad umbrella of sport and exercise. And my first master's was on exercise science and performance enhancement. I've been a trainer for, I guess, 15 years now. That makes me sound old. And yeah, I started 3D Muscle Journey way back in the day with my three colleagues. Essentially, the way I describe what our mission statement is to support the lifting community towards having sustainable careers. So looking at ways to lift and be involved competitively even for as long as you want. So that involves not only performance enhancement, but also looking about how to integrate it with life and how to make sure you're still enjoying what you're doing. So if you do decide to stop, it's your choice rather than the horse riding you versus you riding the horse, if you will. So I'm the chief science officer because I like Star Trek of 3D Muscle Journey. I'm a research reviewer for Mass Monthly Applications in Strength Sport. I'm an author of some books on understanding the principles of training and nutrition. I'm a competitive natural bodybuilder and all-around mediocre strength athlete, showing how I can be mediocre in many, many different ways. And shit, what else? I'm a research fellow with about 7 PhD and master students here at the Auckland University of Technology, now part-time. And I'm a full-time podcast guest alongside Mike Israetel, where it seems like we just basically go on the same podcasts all the time, which I'm fine with.
Is it my turn now, Igor?
Yeah.
Cool. I'll keep it per your request shorter. I'm also shorter than Eric Helms by roughly 6 inches in every dimension. So give that some thought. And I have a PhD in sport physiology from East Tennessee State University under Dr. Mike Stone, and been a professor for a while at a bunch of different schools. Right now, I am a professor at Lehman College in the Bronx, though I only commune through the internet, so I don't actually live in the Bronx, for those of you asking me when I tag myself there. And that is under Dr. Brad Schoenfeld's master's in strength and hypertrophy, essentially. So I teach some courses for him, and I'm also the, some kind of title, chief sports scientist or something. We keep messing with the titles at Renaissance Periodization, for whom I also make a ton of YouTube videos and write a bunch of books and create a bunch of apps. So mostly I just sit at home and stare at my computer screen. And when I'm not doing that, I'm either training in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which I love and I'm not terrible at, or bodybuilding, which I love, but am incrementally not as terrible at as I used to be. So that's the deal.
Okay, that sounds good. Eric, I think most of us can relate to the fact that we start coaching a bit too soon and we suck at the beginning. but I believe you surpassed most people, so that's a few credit
Maybe.
points.
I'll take it if you say so.
All right, so alluding back to our conversation before we started recording, I wanted to talk to you about periodization and autoregulation as tools that we have for programming. And I wanted to get your takes on how useful they think they are, how necessary do you think they are, and how complicated are they to execute from a standpoint of both a coach and an athlete? For either or both advanced trainees, whether it being team sports athletes, marathon runners, or just bodybuilders and powerlifters, as well as the general population.
You want to start, Mike, or you want me to start?
I can start this one if it's okay with you.
Go for it.
Yeah, so that's a whole lot of question, even. Periodization. What is it? Does it work? Why? For whom? When? So periodization and autoregulation. I think autoregulation is just a subset of the process and act of periodizing. So periodization is essentially having some sort of structure to your training in order to maximize progress, reduce the rate of injury, and lastly, and this is only applicable in some cases, not really for the general population most, is to peak at kind of the right time versus the wrong time, because timing is critical to a bunch of competitive sports. And nobody cares how fast you ran the 100, 3 days before the Olympics. They only care how fast you run it at the Olympics. So periodization is, in my view, a set of general ideas. And it can be incredibly useful if you really need some kind of structure to your training and some dependable soft rules by which to alter things to keep them going kind of in the right direction. Here's a quick example. We know from lots of research and a lot of sort of physiological rationale that generally when you train harder and harder and harder and really, really, really hard, you tend to get to a point better and better underlying fitness developed. So you're getting in better shape. But in the grand refutation of the Rocky movies, you also accrue fatigue. As you get better and better and better, the training that is super hard also makes you fatigued. And we know that certain kinds of training can keep your fitness at a relatively high level, conserving what you've built. These other kinds of training can actually let your fatigue fall considerably during that very same time. So what we can do with just that one very general concept, that's not all of periodization, just a sample, is we can say, okay, if we want to have a really, really good competition, that's going to be in 5 weeks, we can train harder and harder and harder for 4 weeks, accruing both fitness and fatigue. And maybe the last week, to some extent, we train in a special way, and hint, it's going to be pretty high intensity, but much lower volume on average. What we're going to do is we're going to keep pretty much all the gains we've made, but we're going to drop a bunch of fatigue, which means our preparedness, our ability to actually show off what we have, is going to be higher than it would be if we were also fatigued while being really fit. And then voila, that very, very general structure has to be taken by autoregulation and adapted to a myriad of different situations, which are highly relevant for competitive sport, and then more relevant as you get to know the athlete better and find out what their individual fitness and fatigue dynamics look like. And it is very important at a very high level of sport. Everyone that goes to the Marathon Olympics peaks in some way, tapers in some way. There just aren't any people left over that don't have some attempt at that whatsoever. But for people just trying to get more jacked and strong, when you get tired, you just take a little bit of break and it sort of handles itself. So a deep, predictable sort of robotic structure is probably not going to give you huge differences in training. So just on generally getting you better, even as a competitive athlete, super detailed periodization is not important. It's much more like the cherry on top. Just train hard and train specifically for your sport. And when you get tired, back off. And right there is where 90% of your gains come from. So I think a lot of folks that love science like Eric and I, they come to periodization and they go, oh my God, this is a miracle. They've got it all figured out. I'm going to get enormous or super strong or super fast. And it's just a small enhancement. For the very elite in athletics, that small enhancement's a big deal because they're already basically in really good shape. They just need that small enhancement to perform at the time of their choosing. For the rest of us, it probably doesn't make a huge difference. And it makes less difference for general fitness folks who really don't have the timing necessary. They do want to avoid injury, but for them, just training specifically and training hard and backing off when you have to, I mean, even though those can be described in periodization terms, they're actually quite simple, and you don't need to get into crazy phase potentiated mesocycles and all this other stuff for general fitness. So I think that's the lay of the land as far as periodization is concerned for me. If you're into general fitness, you should know a little bit about it, and just generally don't be stupid with your training. If you want to really get good results, you should start to know a little bit more about it, but understand that it only pays small dividends to get super specific. If you're a high-level athlete, it's either you or your coaching staff around you have to have a real good understanding, but not just of the general principles of how they interlace with your own responses. And there needs to be a huge, constant fine-tuning to find out what kind of manipulations get you your possible best performance.
I love that. Igor, if you don't want to do any, is it Igor or Igor before I keep calling the wrong name? Igor, thank you for correcting me.
Igor's like the Transylvania version.
Well, you know, I just want to make sure I get it right. I don't want you to make you feel like you're assisting someone in raising the dead. So yeah, if you don't want to do any follow-up questions with Mike on that, I think I could nicely bridge some concepts and kind of round out some of the edges there.
Go for it.
Cool. So yeah, I think Mike did a really good job there of kind of positioning the way to view it. I think where a lot of people often get hung up when they are exposed to periodization is when one of the first things that you'll see if you read about periodization is the organizational structure of it. So macrocycles, mesocycles, and microcycles. And I'll often say in parentheses in your textbook, like often a whole year or 6 months or a season. And then the next one is, you know, a month, maybe 2, maybe 6 weeks. And the next one is roughly a week. And then they have individual sessions, which are individual sessions. Now, you mentioned team sport athletes, strength athletes, endurance athletes, basically all athletes. There are some athletes who play a game every week for months. There are some athletes who compete twice a year. You know, we were off air, we were talking about high-level powerlifters. So, you know, for example, Bryce Lewis, who I work with, you know, when he's the USAPL national champion, he just does nationals and then he does worlds. And occasionally, you know, we might do a third meet or something like that. And that's very different to someone who is, let's say, not competing in the USAPL, like you mentioned, Mike, off air, who's just doing a couple different meets based on their work schedule and stuff like that. They might be very serious athletes, but at the same time, you know, there's not a schedule. So making an annual plan for them and following that structure is challenging to know what that looks like. So one of the things that I think we have to think about in terms of periodization and autoregulation, I see, and this is one of the principles of fitness that almost pretty much everyone agrees upon, is the principle of individualization. And periodization is basically the structure of how we organize someone's training. I think the loosest definition that I really like, because it applies across people, whether they're in fitness and they don't need to worry about trying to peak at a specific time most of the time, or even someone who does, is one by Buford et al. In 2007. And one of my PhD mentors, Dr. Mike Zerdos, he likes to use this as a definition because of the flexibility of being able to apply it to different people. And that's the purposeful manipulation of variables to enhance performance. So that's pretty much everybody. It's hard to find someone who disagrees with that as being a good thing, unless you're like, no, I am just going to lift the same weights for 10 all the time. And if I get better, I get better. If not, I've obviously hit my genetic ceiling. So, so I think while that definition is probably not nuanced enough for someone who is trying to train for and peak at the Olympics and World Championships and qualify in their country, it doesn't not describe that. It just doesn't include some of those peaking elements that Mike talked about. So if we just look at it as, okay, I'm going to manipulate variables in a purposeful way to improve performance, yeah, everybody likes that. And then if we also agree that individualization is something we all think is important, because people are not all the same, autoregulation is simply the systematic way of making your periodization more individualized. So if you were to use some type of, let's say you have a velocity tracker. If you were using velocity stops or decay percentages, or if you were using RPE, if you didn't have that, or RIR, you would be customizing the individual's reps performed at a given load or proximity to failure based on what you've seen responds best to them, rather than giving them just a percentage of 1RM, when some people can do 5 reps at 80%, other people can do 15. And yeah, that's real data. So, you know, being able to take these broad principles and make them more and more and more and more specific to your training history, preferences, physiology, etc., psychology, that's basically what we're trying to do with autoregulation, is make the periodization terms more applicable. And then the other element, the reason why I talked about timing, is that essentially if you take a more bottom-up construction, you take the principles that Mike is talking about in periodization of managing fatigue and dumping fatigue at the right time while maintaining all the adaptations you've tried to get to have a reasonably predictive ability to be at least performing pretty well at a given time point, you can collect all those together and go, all right, so when does my athlete compete? When do they need to be at their best? How long is it going to take for them to get to their best? And you work backwards from there. So instead of having a macro cycle for a power lifter, you might look at, all right, I got 2 comps. They're 4 months apart. What's the best way for me to get them in good enough position to qualify here, but then really knock it out of the park here? Or maybe the other way around, or both, you know? So you have this kind of emergent structure where there are still macro, meso, and microcycles, but they are dependent on when the athlete is competing. And then other elements that I'm sure we'll get into, those levels of complexity may or may not be applicable. So I think Mike and I don't want to speak for you, Mike, but correct me if you feel like I'm wrong, most of our experience, both personally in working with athletes and in our studies, have to do with strength and physique athletes. And I actually appreciate that, because I think the relationship between slow speed, maximal strength, and hypertrophy is one of the more clear ones. I'm much less confident in some of the ideas of, all right, will the max strength phase actually help me at a high velocity power? I don't know. Like slower velocity, like power, because all things that move have power, because it's force times velocity, right? But if throwing a baseball, was that really going to help me if I've gotten my bench up to a massive 1RM? Much less confident than, let's say, a Highland Games guy throwing like a 20-pound stone, or even more so, someone who's actually benching 1RM, right? But the relationship between strength and hypertrophy, and I do mean like 1RM strength on relatively slow speed movements, that's much clearer. Like when you look at cross-sectional data in strength athletes, hugely strong relationships between multiple different metrics of muscle mass and strength. So, and then, you know, it gets less clear over the short term. So we know that it's probably going to take time to build up sufficient muscle mass to have a large impact on strength. So you can have a phasic approach in our sports. Like for a power lifter, you know, you'd probably want to precede strength phases with hypertrophy work, and then figure out during the strength phase, is the sufficient strength volume to maintain my strength? And then, okay, during my taper. So it's this almost emergent phasic approach for our sport. And I think I've started to get off into a little bit of a tangent, but I think the main things I wanted to say is that the time scale should be bootstrapped to the time scales of the athlete, and autoregulation should be seen as a way of individualizing the various variables that Buford talked about that we're trying to manipulate, so that they are more individualized.
Okay, I think both of you covered more than enough of the question. Now, I wanted to talk to you about a more relevant topic, I would say, since both of you are using both autoregulation and periodization as tools in both your programming and your athletes' programming. How did you respond using these tools when something surprising happens, like say an injury, or in our case, a freaking world pandemic? And I would even love to hear about your personal stories on how did you respond to it to maintain and work on your goals as fitness enthusiasts.
So I actually, I had an interesting number of things all happened around the same time, which reinforced an experience, and which also led me down like a path of reading about it as well, of the utility of low volume, highly specific, which means high intensity and strength sport training, as a way to kind of like maintain strength and bridge periods of like, what the hell is going on? So those things were, I had a hip injury in 2017 that I got finally corrected with surgery. And then I actually had a neck injury that didn't end up needing surgery, thank God, that I had to work around. And then we had the pandemic. And then I also decided that I wanted to pursue an ever increasing number of strength sports. And hopefully I don't make any new ones, because I'll have to do those too. So when I've increased the number of things I need to be good at, you're kind of in this weird situation. And I think a good analogy is, imagine that you're trying to cook, like, let's say you're like on MasterChef and you're trying to cook like 4 different dishes at the same time. It's just you, and you've got a bunch of burners and you're doing all this stuff at the same time. You have to figure out some way, if you're trying to kind of collectively peak everything, of putting things on the quote unquote back burner. So it stays warm. It doesn't need to be, reheated up, slowing you down, and then, having to do that. But also, you can't take up the burners because you got to be focusing on other dishes. And I think low volume, high intensity specific work is useful, because it's the most potent set that you can have for the specific immediate goal of being strong. So when I came back from my hip surgery, I was detrained. I didn't need much volume to progress my squat. And I still had size because I was able to train around it. So I thought, well, why don't I just come in and do moderate RPE singles and just kind of let my strength come back? And within 24 weeks post-surgery, I hit a high bar squat PR. And I was like, what the hell is going on? Like, I thought that shouldn't be able to happen. And I was like, I guess it makes sense, So similarly, during the pandemic, I kept having these goals, and we had 2 lockdowns in New Zealand where I wasn't able to do certain things. And I found that with kind of this minimum exposure and this focus on what's the minimum amount I need to do, that being able to just come in and do a single at a moderate RPE, it's not that fatiguing. And it is able to maintain strength quite effectively, or at least a lot of it. And I found it was a really good way to bridge uncertainty, or even bridge blocks. So if we kind of go back to the late 80s, early 90s, daily undulating periodization comes onto the scene. And it's one of the multiple methods of periodization where they try to solve, quote unquote, the problem of kind of your original Western model of having multiple months spent on one adaptation for like typically team sport athletes, or those who have multiple athletic domains they need to be good at. Sort of similar to a multi-sport strength athlete, but actually more in terms of real athleticism, like aerobic power, anaerobic power, skill, strength, etc. And one of the solutions was, well, instead of just having these large blocks, let's do a little bit of the thing we just did, or the thing that's coming, to kind of bridge those phases, so there's less decay in those attributes, so that the net result in all the different characteristics we're trying to bump up is better. And there's the way this kind of comes into play in resistance training is that even in phases where you're doing higher volume, high repetition work, there's some lower-ish rep work where you're bridging to the next block, where there is just a little bit of higher rep work, so you can maintain work capacity, have a better bridge for strength. So you don't end up going from something like 5x10 to 3x3, which isn't a good idea, and that's not necessarily what anyone specifically recommended. But there is a potential issue there. So that same concept you can apply by doing like not that frequent singles and like a 5 or a 6 RPE. So we're talking like a single at 85 to 87% of 1RM, somewhere in there, depending on how many reps you can do at that load. Not that frequently, and maybe as kind of like the start, your last warm-up-ish, or the start to post-activation potentiation before you do your 8s in a volume block. And then as you get into a more intensified block, you might do a single at a higher RPE, and that singles might increase in frequency and increase in RPE as you get closer to your meet. So that method of training is interesting because it also gives you the diagnostic awareness of what your estimated 1RM is with some reasonable fidelity in any given time. But in addition to that, what I found is that I could hold on to my 1RM strength during a volume block or during an uncertain time when I didn't know if the gym was going to be closed, or when I'm trying to get strong on like 7 different lifts. That's very difficult to have a volume block on all of them at the same time. That I can kind of put one on the quote unquote back burner and just once a week work up to a 6 or 7, maybe even 8 RPE. And I find that on lifts that I'm less skilled at, damn it, that was all I needed to improve. I didn't even need the volume because I had a lot of those general characteristics of a strength athlete already from my prior training. And on the movements where I was much more highly trained on, like say the powerlifting movements where I've been at it for a long time, those I would actually need to dedicate more time to because I was closer to my ceiling. So this interesting kind of emergent process of using the single, the minimum but most effective exposure at a moderate intensity to also make sure the fatigue wasn't too high, or even injury risk, you could argue, in combination in like this rotating fashion, became something that was useful during the pandemic, useful during injury recovery, and useful when I'm trying to compete in multiple different sports in the same year. So obviously that's not very helpful to anyone because I have a very unique situation. But if you do happen to compete in Highland Games, strongman, powerlifting, weightlifting, and bodybuilding during a pandemic after a hip injury, I just solved your problems.
I've also noticed that you've been doing some bodyweight work, being stuff like pistol squats or one-arm push-ups. Was that a part of the plan, or was it just you messing around?
No, that was basically that the first lockdown happened and I wasn't prepared and I didn't have enough gear. So it was, how often do I want to do floor presses with, 90 kilos and bands wrapped around my body and tearing at my back versus, maybe every once in a while I'll do a single arm push up and like, I got a little tired of having to do like, if I pressed in my old apartment garage, I would hit the ceiling with the plates. So I didn't have I can do a half kneeling barbell press. Like, what is this? Or I can do like dumbbells that only went up to, there was just not that, I didn't have a lot of options. So, my overhead pressing, I was limited in my dumbbell size or I was limited in my ceiling height. And I couldn't really do it seated because I'm not going to like clean 90 kilos and sit into a dining chair and then press in a garage. That's a great way to kill yourself. So I was weighing up the likelihood of getting stronger versus being on an epic gym fails video. And there's a classic period where I had to pull down my own recommendation for pulling down your doors for pull-ups. So it was a learning process for everyone. We're just trying to figure out how to work out at home. So that was mostly just me working around limited equipment. It wasn't the ideal plan. It was just what I had to do.
Got you. How about you, Mike?
Oh, that was awesome. So I was dieting for what was supposed to be a bodybuilding show when the pandemic hit. And that was slightly disconcerting because, it's kind of a big deal. A lot of eggs in one basket. And I think, I've been injured a lot before. And I've coached a lot of people through injuries. So injury and pandemic are similar in these sort of aberrant situations. But I think you only need to fundamentally consider 2 things. What are my abilities now? And it doesn't matter what they used to be because it is no longer the used to be times. It is the now times. And I think a lot of people have quite a bit of psychological pain at the attachment to what used to be. And it's really, really, really pointless to do that. And it's worse than pointless, it's in that negative, because you can't re-arc the universe, move time backwards and go back to pre-pandemic. You can't attach your tendons using your mind back into your pecs. So you just have to accept things as they are and accept 2 new things. 1, what are my capabilities now? 2, what are my limitations now? And then once you have both capabilities and limitations, through those 2 variables, you interweave and arrange a training plan. And that's really it. Every time we coach someone, including ourselves, we do that anyway. You don't coach someone who can't bench press 100 kilos as if they can bench press 200 because they're limited by less than 100 kilos in the bench. And if they don't have a Smith machine at their gym, but they do have a hack squat, you don't pretend like they have a Smith machine. It's really quite straightforward. So you do that anyway, and it's just an interesting idea that people, I think, spend a lot of time psychologically rebelling against what's happening versus just accepting those two things. As soon as I did that, I was like, okay, well, my business partner and friend, Charlie, and I, we both lived in Philadelphia together at the time. We were training partners. We were both dieting and training hard. We quickly purchased some rudimentary equipment to make a home gym in my apartment. We also had a few gyms to go to. Some of our friends had private facilities that were an obscene driving distance away, but nonetheless, we made it out a couple times a week to train heavy legs. And these were facilities where social distancing was not an issue because it was just us. So we sort of got together these pieces of equipment, got together this arrangement of training, and then plugged forward. And was it ideal? No. I'm just now healing from some kind of sartorius or adductor strain that I got because I was basically hip hinging like 6 times a week. I was bent rowing with a barbell or dumbbells like 3 or 4 times a week. And I was doing squats and stiff legged deadlifts and good mornings a bunch because of the incredibly limited equipment we had. And it turns out that one of my hip hingers did not like that. So after several months, it began to be very sore and painful, and I couldn't do a lot of stuff anymore. Had to work around that, successfully did. Now it's healing. Now that I live in Las Vegas and it's not on lockdown, we have access to some of the best gyms in the world, and it's smooth sailing. And I lost a bunch of body fat, gained a little bit of muscle during that very trying time. Though I felt like it many times, I didn't give up. And because I didn't give up, I have a much cooler physique. And then as soon as we moved to Las Vegas, I was able to restart my fat loss diet. And this was during the summer, and gyms remained open. I finished the fat loss diet. It was a sum total, well, not sum total in 2020, I dieted for like 36 weeks, I think. But it was a 22-week diet towards the tail end. And I won some division and overall hardware at my last bodybuilding show. And there's always that 2-factor problem. What are your abilities? What are your limitations? Forget about what it used to be and go from there is my best advice to anyone facing those kinds of problems.
Okay, I think I definitely agree with that. Now, if I may, I wanted to talk about at least my experience on the matter, which is fairly similar. I think one of my lifters was, she was dealing with a quote unquote problem with the fact that she could have some equipment, but it wasn't really all the time, meaning she had access to a barbell maybe once in every couple of weeks, access to a dumbbell maybe once a month or so. And I don't know how it was for you in the US or New Zealand, but here in Israel, I think gyms were shut down 80% of this year. So it was fairly rough. So we just had a conversation and I asked her, what's the minimal equipment that you have right now and will consistently have? And we just built a program around that. And if we knew that she would have some equipment next week or the week after that, we would just, I want us to talk about the more controversial topic. And it is about John Kaley's approach on periodization and the fact that he, at least from what he was writing in his articles, he was looking at training as more of a random concept, being that we cannot expect or get a clear picture of what the future might hold for us as far as a thought out, structured plan for the future. Mike, go for it.
Eric, if you don't mind.
You seem eager.
Not at all.
Yeah. If you're willing to, I don't mean to use the term caricature as something that is an illusory representation. I think in this case it's fairly accurate, but if you need to caricature his views as you actually just said, that there is a very big difficulty in predicting any sort of planned responses and thus drawing up training plans. I don't think that's a mischaracterization of his views. I had the opportunity to read several of his articles, and then I had the opportunity a little while back to, I suppose, have a debate, quote unquote, chat with him on a podcast. And I don't think you're mischaracterizing his views. I think they are pretty in that vein of, there's not much structure there. I disagree to a very high extent with that take. I'll make my disagreement more specific. I think that the fraction of people who develop better maximal strength from sets of 10 than sets of 2 is incredibly small. You can consider those individuals aberrant to the extent that we are not going to develop a general theory of training around them. We will count them as exceptions to rules. And it's okay because almost all rules have exceptions, and that's fine. That does not discard the general rule as valuable. So first point. Second point, there are very few people whom, after only 1 or 2 weeks of training in any specific style, maximize their adaptations to that style. So if we're training for peak strength, is very, very few people out of any sort of training population will reach their best 1RM strength result after only 1 or 2 weeks of doing doubles or sets of 10. Many more people will take weeks, plural, usually in the 4 to 8 week range at least, in order to start seeing a leveling off of adaptations, because we know multiple weeks, at least a month, of training something you haven't really trained a lot before, specifically, tends to elevate adaptations rather rapidly and rather predictably. So just with those two observations, if we have a powerlifting meet in 4 months and we want some measure of hypertrophic adaptation, some measure of being very ready to show off our 1RMs, and you told me, well, it's all kind of random. Some people do better with 10, some people do better with sets of 2. I know it's just an example. I'm not advocating doing only 10s and only sets of 2. But just at the extremes as an example, if someone said, oh, it's all individual, it's got to be auto-regulated, I don't think that's a good enough answer. I think a much better answer is, well, for multiple weeks before the powerlifting meet, you got to want to do something like a lot of sets of 2, because almost in every case, it's going to make you really good at doing sets of 1, better than if you just practice sets of 10 all the time. Secondly, right, you don't want to do a lot of sets of 10 right before that meet, because that's recovery adaptation you could have spent doing sets of 2 or recovering from sets of 2. And lastly, if you said, well, I'll do sets of 2, and it's just going to be a situation where I do sets of 2 for, sorry, I got some interference here. I'm in a public place. If you're doing sets of 2 for 1 or 2 weeks before the meet, you look at me and you say, is that good enough? I'll say, no, you probably want to do sets of 2 for at least a month before your big show off 1RM, because it's going to take that long for most people to accumulate the level of adaptations that start to become asymptotic in nature. So when people say things at the extremes, and I believe, I don't know if John Kaley quite means it as extreme as I certainly have received it, and Igor, apparently you as well. I don't want to speak for you, however. It to me seemed like his caricature of periodization and sort of his caricature of the extent to which things are unpredictable and individualistic or individually based, I think is a bit extreme. I think there are predictable things, just like I described. Yes, you do get stronger for your 1RMs, having recently trained sets of 2 versus sets of 10. And yes, it will take some time, like a month or more. So those 2 rules right there, we already have a looking forward periodized structure that we absolutely should auto-regulate. And maybe they're the exception, and maybe sets of 3 are better, maybe sets of 1, maybe some combination of the 2 is better, but those constraints are in place and they fundamentally have a reality that can be applied looking forward. That's my take.
Good take. So I think the challenge of having the one true correct interpretation of John Kaley's work is that there isn't a one true correct interpretation of periodization. I think Mike and I both think there should be one, and we probably agree very similarly on what its definition is. And we kind of presented it early in this conversation, but there are plenty of people who would disagree with us on that definition. I can think of very prominent people in the space of periodization who would think it was too loosey-goosey. You know, this whole Buford et al. 2007 definition I gave of just manipulating variables. And I think if you read Kaley's work as a refutation of what Mike and I said, it can seem really like strawmanny or unnecessary or kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I think if you read the work as a refutation of the more dogmatic, everyone needs to have an annual cycle, you should be able to forecast performance some point next year in October.
These are the exact reps you have to do to get the following adaptation, that sort of thing.
Exactly. No, we're not doing 12s now, we're doing 10s. But don't
you don't understand the difference.
No. Yeah, exactly. Those are different underlying physiology. So I think that then you can see where it comes from. So it's a tough one to. I think it depends on where you come from and what you've read and which definition of periodization you like to fully appreciate where Kaley is coming from. I've had the pleasure of meeting John Kaley at a couple of conferences. We also had him on Iron Culture. So I've got to talk with him, and I think, I brought him on as someone who uses periodization in the style that we talked about and had a non-debate with him. So I really do think it kind of like it's periodization is not a well-defined set of principles. I think it would be nice if it was, but I think there's enough disagreement in even in the peer-reviewed literature. There's a ton of back and forths between people who are arguing about block periodization versus this style of periodization, where it is very difficult to decide what the consensus is. And I think, like I said, Mike and I there's a consensus that we could come to that we'd both be pretty happy with, and move forward. And I think it's probably the consensus that most good coaches operate within the space of powerlifting, bodybuilding, weightlifting in general, I would say. So Kaley's critiques, if you look at his 2012 paper, I think the main things that he emphasizes are just how extreme individual responses can be in terms of the magnitude and the time course, and even how individuals, after given time points or different phases of their life, will adapt differently to the same stimuli. So it's essentially saying that if you read the periodization literature and you expected it to be very easy to forecast these things for everyone, rather than applying it on a case-to-case basis and then using the same principles but modulated to the individual time course and magnitude of adaptation, you're going to get it wrong. And that there are people who promote it in that way, that everyone should be in almost a cookie cutter periodization style. And I think it is difficult, having written textbooks chapters, to describe something in amorphous terms that can be applied to everyone without also leaving the reader feeling like they have no tools. And that's a difficult needle to thread. So I don't want to just be like, see, periodization, big periodization put that a mesocycle has to be a month, but that doesn't work for people. Fools, I don't think that's fair. But I do think it is really important to understand just how crazy individual variation is. And I think that was one of the biggest take homes from 2012 paper by Kaley. Another piece of that he did acknowledge is that when you look at the data on monotony and strain, that having an element of variability does seem to minimize those things. And that is something inherent to periodization, that having phasic periods of higher volumes, lower volumes, higher intensities, lower intensities is probably better for reducing the occurrence of upper chest infections and injuries, which has been shown across a lot of different sports. Not a whole lot of data in our little sport, but I have no reason to believe that'd be different. And then in 2016, I think what is a really, really important take home is that sometimes we're a little more in the kind of the biomedical world in the strength conditioning community. We like to, I don't want to characterize it unfairly, but I think a lot of the times we forget just how interdependent some of these variables are. So for example, a single session of training does like three things. It does induce fatigue and it does induce fitness. but it also will acutely prime you for additional performance. Like we just reviewed a paper in mass where doing like basically a single or a double at 80% of 1RM makes you stronger, or at least I should say more accurately, improves your velocity at 80% of 1RM 6 hours later. But it does also make you fatigued. And it also does build long-term fitness that is not probably just some temporal transient impact on your strength capacity. And those three things are happening simultaneously, and we're all measuring them, and we're measuring all through the same way, performance. Then there's more layers to that. So if you show athletes two different videos, one that is inspiring and arousing and motivating versus one that is depressing, that has a measurable impact on their performance in the next session they do. If you look at data on wound healing, people who are in conflict can heal much slower, which is directly related to synthesizing tissue, right? And you'd think that probably has some impact on potentially morphological adaptations to resistance training. We have data that the more reported adverse life events, so basically perceived stress in your life, has a modest impact on the rate of strength gains. So when you start to layer all those things together, and then if you look at kind of like the 1950s interpretation of the gas model, it's not that the model is refuted, and it absolutely isn't. I think we have so much empirical data in both humans and animals that it would be, it's a completely untenable position to say that we don't have an initial alarm response, then we adapt to it. But if you do too much of the thing that you're trying to adapt to too fast, it'll cause problems, and that you won't be able to recover from it. So I don't know that anyone's arguing against that general model, but the fact that it's layered with an individual, gas response in terms of time course and magnitude, how much you can handle, and that is also then going to be affected by psychosocial impacts, that is also going to be affected by fatigue, fitness, and priming, all coming from the same thing, that it really pays to have that autoregulation piece and to pay attention to the individual. So I think those are the things I would really encourage someone to take from John Kaley's model, is that if you expect predictability across broad populations using rigid models of periodization, at best, you're going to be disappointed. At worst, you're going to probably be doing a disservice to a lot of your athletes. And I think it is truly a call to action for trying to tease out what is causing these individual differences, for not divorcing the quantitative realm of sports science and the qualitative realm of coaching, to cultivate a good team environment, to get your athletes in the right mindset before they hit the gym. And you can apply this to yourself. If you're stuck in traffic for 40 minutes because you had to drive out of town during the pandemic, like Mike was talking about, and you get to the gym frustrated as shit and just annoyed and uncomfortable, what ritual do you have to get yourself in the right mind state? Because we have good reason to believe that that'll impact things. If your periodization model doesn't give a shit that you're in med school during exams, you just do it anyway, it's probably a bad idea. We have a bunch of data showing that during exam periods, college athletes don't perform as well. If you're in a state of high levels of emotional stress, all of these things, I think if you don't take those into account, and if you just follow a stock standard approach, you can be doing a big disservice. So I do think it's easy to view Kaley's work, if you've already come from a more holistic view of periodization, as throwing the baby out in the bathwater. But I think if you've been exposed to a much more dogmatic version of periodization, it can truly be something that leads you towards much better practice and acknowledging those variables that you thought didn't matter if you just quote unquote had the magic formula for periodization.
Okay, actually that even covers my next question. And when you talked about that, nobody's really critiquing the gas model, you'd be surprised. What I wanted to talk to you afterwards is exactly that. It might be not as popular, but I've heard a few people talking about it not being as relevant since it's mostly based on animals, which in my opinion is, I don't know if I want to say kind of bullshit, since as you mentioned, Eric, we do have enough empirical data to interpret that in humans as well.
Also, humans are animals. Like
Yeah.
I hate to tell everybody.
and to that end, really quick, you know, our genetic similarities with mice is 92%. Like, we're just slightly bigger brains, slightly different shaped versions of mice. Like, the underlying deep structures. So, for example, the mTOR and AMPK pathways are like a billion years old and fucking largely unchanged in tens of millions of years. If mice do something at a basic level with AMPK and mTOR, you had better be first guess should be humans do it very similarly. Now, sometimes that doesn't work, but if you're talking about fitness fatigue dynamics, the way systems handle stress, if something occurs in animals, man, it's a good bet it happens. It's not a guarantee, not the basis of an argument, however, as a first argument.
I totally agree with that. Like, I think if you're going to critique an animal model, there's basically two allowable critiques that will get you the Helms nod, which everyone, of course, is striving for. That's truly what we're all trying to achieve.
It's like Nobel Prize.
Yeah, Nobel Prize, Helms nod. You know. Anyway, but in all seriousness, I think these are two valid critiques. One is saying that's really interesting. I would like to see if it's possible. Of course, some things aren't ethical for that to be replicated in humans. The other potential one is if there is a specific pathway or issue that is known to go, oh, wow, we really can't extrapolate that. For example, BCA metabolism in mice is very different. Fructose metabolism and some carbohydrate metabolism has some important caveats. And some proponents of ketogenic diets and the impacts of different macronutrients fed in excess to mice have used mouse study data fallaciously. I'm saying something that almost sounds sexual.
Fallaciously.
Thank you. Fallaciously.
Which still sounds sexual for the record.
It does. Yes. I feel like I'm being a bad boy. Those can be specifically problematic, but that's not then to go, well, I don't know these pathways, but I heard that one time the mouse study was a problem, so screw all animal data. So those are the two times it's okay. Is there a specific problem? And also just tempering your overall conclusion, saying like, oh, this is really interesting, we need further data. It's not acceptable, as much as I agree with Mike and what I just said to myself, obviously. It's not acceptable when there is better data than animal data on humans to then use the animal study as is more appropriate. But sometimes I will say you can get a level of control with animals that can show more clearly a model, and the human data might still follow that model accordingly, but might have much more variability due to all the variability that is in a human's life because we're not being fed a standard chow diet and being forced to do exercise and stuff.
I am.
Well, good. I mean, that's why you get the gains. That's why you get the gains, my friend. So yeah, I would put that forth.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you guys. I think that going down that route is just going down too far deep into the quote unquote critical thinking rabbit hole, or at least that you're thinking critically, but in reality, you're just, sorry for the phrasing, but you're getting too far into your own ass.
No, I agree, man. And I think, like, I do think it's important for us to think more critically about the gas model instead of divvying things up into distinct things, because it is not purely correct to just call exercise a stressor. Like, it's not just a stressor, we have a ton of data showing that exercise reduces stress.
It's a stimulator too.
Exactly. So humans have a tough time holding two things that do multiple things. It is much cleaner mathematically and intuitively when we don't have to carry conflicting information. And so models, there's a fantastic quote from the statistician Stephen Box. I'm just gonna say Box because I probably have his name wrong. That all models are wrong, but some models are useful. And I definitely think the understanding of the gas model is useful. And of course, it's not nuanced enough or perfect, but you don't reject it because you start with the idea that a model is a heuristic, and a heuristic either is helpful in more cases than not, or it's not. And I think it's really hard to say that the gas model is not, because then you have to reject overtraining, and some people have said, hey, it's way too hard to predict overtraining. But not being able to predict when something I can't predict when a volcano is going to happen. Therefore, volcanoes aren't real. not the way it works.
No,
right?
not at all. You push it. So I'll just, Eric, if you don't mind, I'll make this a more specific critique on my end. I don't know, Eric, if you mean it this way, and I don't want to drag you into this, but I'll just speak for myself, and you guys can add in as you like. I had an opportunity to experience this sort of line of reasoning when I read the book Squat Every Day some number of years ago. It was sent to me because it was apparently a refutation of the sports science I learned in school. And it was sent to me as kind of like, what do you think? This guy's smart. And at the time, the gentleman that wrote it, he had a number of Facebook quotes, sort of the extent of like, I'm so much smarter than all the rest of you. I'm like drunk debating you and still winning. So LOL. And I was like, I'll take a shot at that title. So I read the book, and there was just some interesting kind of, how would I say it? There was a flirtation of making a point. It never actually occurred. Parts of the book were like, when I wasn't getting the results I wanted, training 2 or 3 times a week, and I started just squatting every day, everyone told me it wouldn't work because that wasn't exercise science. And I was like, I know a lot of exercise science, man. I never learned that doing something every day was somehow sort of like on first principles a bad idea. As long as you balance out the total volume and intensity exposure and you're sort of remotely healed session to session, I think that could probably work. Gymnasts train every day. Nobody's beating them to death with exercise science books. Although it'd be very hard. Gymnasts are quite hardy folks. So, and chasing them down again is a problem, because what if they go on a set of uneven bars when you're trying to hit them? Anyway, so at the end of the day, it was kind of like, and then so squatting every day, put a ton of weight on my squat, and it really, really worked. And it flies in the face of the gas model, and it flies in the face of standard exercise science. And at the end of the day, I'm not sure what's going on. It was quite mysterious, but we know that. And then he started getting into sort of nonlinear systems, other weird shit, which I just consider mental masturbation at that point. And I was asked, so what do you think about this? So I think, if you dose a stimulus and you recover sufficiently to have another productive stimulus, and you dose that stimulus and you sufficiently recover to have another productive stimulus, you're well on your way to getting stronger. And you could dose that stimulus 6 times a week. You could dose it twice a week. It would just be a different dose. And the somewhere between those two is probably a really good sustainable way of doing things. Unfortunately, for most of the squat everyday crowd, they overdosed the stimulus too frequently, and most of them got shat out the other end with tons of knee injuries and back injuries and overtraining like symptoms. And there was no refutation of the gas model. We didn't have to reinvent the wheel. It was just a slightly different frequency paradigm. So unfortunately, and this doesn't just apply to that particular book and that particular author, just being as respectful as I can, I think a lot of people, when they say things like, well, I think the gas model doesn't really work as a complete, my proposition to them is, so what part of it is wrong? Why? And what are you proposing? How do you propose the universe looks in its stead? And I never really get a good answer to that shit. Do you think fatigue accumulates if you train hard enough? Do you think fatigue exists? Do you think fitness accumulates? Do you think, that exercise exposes you to a very, myriad of stressors at the same time and stimulants at the same time? Do you think curves decay? Is there a decay rate for any adaptation or any fatigue? And the answer usually yes to all of those. Like, well, you just reinvented fucking gas. We have a name for it already. And the thing is, does it apply exactly like in the textbook? No, it was just one example of one very linear system. Are there a bunch of different curves that are initiated with every exercise? Yes. Do they have different amplitudes? Yes. Do they have different durations? Yes. Can you intersect them differently to have very, very different frequencies at which great results can happen with varying degrees of sustainability? Of course, the answer is yes. But because something can be more nuanced and thus better when it is more nuanced does not make it false. Okay, just because the Ford Model T isn't as good as a 2021 Honda Civic, it doesn't mean a car with 4 fucking wheels and a steering wheel is the wrong answer to transportation. It can simply be improved. That doesn't mean it's wrong.
I totally agree with that. I'll be happily roped into it. I think a lot of
Matt Perryman, that was his name.
And the funny thing is, I love Matt Perryman's stuff, and I think he had some really good ideas. But I think a lot of the time, if you get a academic education truly at a higher level, where you are not taught to memorize stuff and pass tests, and you are taught critical thinking with a good mentor, you almost step outside of the typical stream of information that is in the general fitness and coaching S&C world. And I think Matt Perryman, much like John Kaley's work, is a refutation of a dogmatic interpretation of this stuff. Like for example, I would say one of the most prolific modern researchers in periodization, Dr. Zerdos, he can tell you all about periodization and how it makes sense and underlying physiology, yet he's also done 73 days in a row of squatting to a max, and he's done research on max squatting. And he's able to hold those concepts together because they don't conflict, in his mind. And how would he tell you how to get towards squatting once per day if that's something you can tolerate without breaking yourself? You start squatting once per week and not to a max.
Yep. Yep.
Then you start squatting twice per week. So it still follows the same principle. It's just you're going, hey, what happens if I completely leverage intensity and frequency and not volume? And that's tenable. You can't just look at the Bulgarian system and go, roids. Like last time I checked, that's not the thing that roids do, is enable you to squat to a max at a higher frequency. Last time I checked, they increased like protein synthesis and enhanced a lot of other qualities. So, I mean, sure, they might help recovery, but I wouldn't even argue. I would argue that a 10 RM is more fatiguing than a 1 RM on just if you're just going to do that in a vacuum.
By a long shot.
Yeah. So it just, I think it's these are important dissidents to a dogmatic approach to exercise science. But I think if you, it's less useful than it's less useful to understand that they're refuting. Sorry, let me try this again. I can speak, I swear to God. It is not useful to think that they're refuting exercise science. It is much more useful to understand that they're refuting the dogma of exercise science, which is too unfortunately common, or they wouldn't be around. But it is a critical distinction, or you can find yourself just lost.
Yep, I agree with you guys. And I think that a part of the problem with that is when people are proposing new ideas that are, as Mike mentioned, reinventing the wheel, while actually not really giving you a different approach, a solution to that, a different explanation, just throwing things just for the sake of throwing out their opinion. Okay, so with that out of the way, I think that an hour and a half is enough for me to steal from your time of the day. And I wanted to finish off for you guys to go for a plug for whatever upcoming projects or things that you want to talk about. I know that 3DMJ has the lifting library, though the sale has ended, right?
Yeah, the sale has ended, so you missed your opportunity, and we have added new chapters. So, I mean, the cool thing was, we add to the lifting library. We build new wings to the library all the time in our online fake university of how to lift. And yeah, so, but if you want to check it out, it's pretty cool. We are still going to add more to it. Yeah. So, but yeah, anything that I have done or involved in, you could probably find at 3dmusclejourney.com, or you can follow me for more like daily content and links out to stuff like this at Helms 3DMJ on Instagram. And then of course the podcast I referenced, Iron Culture, myself and Omar Yusuf, just kind of doing a broad, view of the entire lifting community. Occasionally we have guests that aren't very good. We've had Mike Israetel on twice. So I can say at least like 97 of our episodes are pretty good at this point. I think we're coming up on 99 or something like that when this comes out. But no, in all seriousness, honored to be on. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Yo, yeah. Honored also.
Oh, and also it's George Box, not Stephen Box.
Oh, there we go.
Sorry, George.
Sorry, Stephen. I mean George. All right. So yeah, I'll just give one plug. Renaissance Periodization on YouTube. We have multiple videos up every week about informative shit, stuff that's described generally in our books, but I can really dig into in YouTube style. The videos are longer, they're more informative, precious few jokes. So if you want to get serious about your learning, the RP YouTube's great. We have other people than me. Spencer Nadolski, Dr. Nadolski's on there talking about health. Right now, one of his cool series that he's doing is, people always say being obese is bad for your health, and they're completely correct. Except if you push most fitness practitioners into being like, okay, how exactly? They're like, well, the fat, it's bad. Being fat's bad. Like I said, it's bad, moralistically. And a lot of times people don't really know what it is physically about being over fat that's bad for your health. Spencer is currently in the middle of, probably 8 or 10 part series. Every single part of the series is its own video about a factor of hyperadiposity that directly makes dyslipidemia was one of them. Glycemic control was one of them. Joint stress from being too heavy is one of them. And basically, like, if you have someone in your family, and you probably do, that's maybe over fat or on their way there, they're scientifically minded, and if you want to sort of open their eyes to like, look, bad stuff is going to happen, and they're kind of tired of the old canard of like, it's bad, and they're like, whatever, I feel fine. If you send them this playlist, if they get through it, they're going to be like, holy shit, you know what? Maybe I'll turn a corner. So it's a lot of great stuff. I'm not the only blabbing mouth on there. Lots of other good stuff. Give Renaissance Periodization YouTube. And you know what? Click on some ads, God damn it. We get paid for the ad clicks. A Lamborghini is a difficult car to maintain. I have 4. I don't want to have 3. That makes me a regular person like you. I want to be better. Give me a fucking 5th Lamborghini, folks. Click on those ads.